This was 2003, just before we moved into Iraq, which was an interesting time to be in Eritrea, I guarantee you. But they said, watch Darfur, and they predicted all of the things that we have seen since then. The complexity of the situation in Darfur now is that you risk the settlement that has happened, at least you are made to believe that you risk the settlement that has happened between the north of Sudan and the south of Sudan, a civil war that has gone on for 20 years and killed perhaps 2 million people. That settlement agreement, the CPA agreement, is a coalition government between the north and south of Iran. President Bashir is now threatening to renege on the north-south agreement if he is brought to trial for the Darfur situation. So we have the classic situation of the competition between peace and justice in this situation. At least he's trying to set up a perceived conflict between peace and justice in the situation. I would direct all of you to a report that came out today from the International Crisis Group precisely on this topic. And their argument is that the only way to solve the problem of peace is by having a justice component, that peace and justice go together. It may not mean you actually prosecute Bashir, but it may be that the threat of prosecution is one of the ways you move to settlement of the overall conflict. This becomes a very complicated political analysis.
Those of us who saw the recent film Reckoning saw that issue raised quite potently in a number of situations. Shireen, you have a personal involvement in an area of the world that recently has undergone some rather interesting dynamics, political dynamics that have certainly human rights overtones in Iran, and the ongoing conflict there. Does that raise any issues that you think may rise to the level of international criminal court crimes? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, okay. Iran has signed the Rome Statute, but it has not ratified it. And as Antonio, our colleague, described earlier, because it has not ratified the Rome Statute, the question of jurisdiction becomes an issue. However, Sudan had not ratified the statute either. The Security Council of the United Nations referred the case to the ICC. So in the case of Iran, the same thing, and in the case of any other country, if crimes against humanity, genocide, or war crimes are committed in that country, the situation can be referred to the ICC through the Security Council of the United Nations, which of course has its own complexity, because then it all depends on the Security Council and whether it is elected to do so.
Do you think any of the activities rise to the level of the types of crimes that the ICC might be involved with? And I sort of asked Antonia to also pipe in on that.
Right. Well, I think that, of course, as we all know, the crimes against humanity have to either be systematic or widespread. So it all depends that whether the crimes that have been perpetrated in Iran fit within that description. Are they systematic against the civilian population, or are they widespread enough? And do they fit within the description and explanation of crimes against humanity? And of course, that's up to the court to decide, and up to the prosecutor to bring enough evidence and introduce to the court and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that such crimes have happened. So if you want to add anything to it.
I think Sharon summed it up perfectly. It's really a question, if the referral appears, it's really a question, it's up to the office of the prosecutor to gather evidence, look up at the situation, and decide whether or not the alleged crimes committed in Iran fit the jurisdiction of the court. And if that is the case, then he will move forward. But this is very hypothetical, and this has not happened. So it will be a question of evidence and of applying the statute.
Rip, any thoughts?
My first thought is that it's hard to imagine how that collection of evidence could be accomplished to include the Iranian situation as a crime against humanity or a war crime or genocide. It requires stretching some definitions as I understand them. That would be the kind of situation that would feed the nightmares of all the people in the United States who really reject the idea of an international criminal court. It would almost create a parade of horribles. I would think it would be an unfortunate thing to happen from the court's perspective, although there are clearly human rights violations that are happening in an enormous way. But the International Criminal Court is not about all human rights violations.
Right.
And we have to be very clear about that.
And I think that was the problem in part with the Venezuelan case that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, there were alleged human rights violations, but as I mentioned before, we are a court of last resort. We only deal with the most serious crimes that are of concern to the international community. So, of course, all crimes have to be investigated, prosecuted, and punished. But not all of the crimes committed in the world fit within the jurisdiction of the court. And it's actually, there are a lot of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed. But let's be realistic. The court will not be able to judge everybody in the world. It's the first and the primary responsible are national courts and national judiciary. That is why the court is a last resort court. That is why we're based on the principle of complementarity. The best, actually, for the court to be very successful, it would be that it would have no case at all to judge, because national jurisdictions would take case of all the cases.
Pregnant in what we've been talking about and the fact that this is really the gathering of a support organization for the ICC in the United States is the question of U.S. support for the ICC. And perhaps I'll throw it out, starting with Rip. What do you think the prospects of our involvement, and by that I mean from A to Z, as an observer, as a commentator, as well as maybe a party to the ICC?
I don't have any special knowledge of what the administration might be. I think I can safely say that the prospects are better than they have been. I think there is a possibility. But much to many people's surprise, even the Bush administration was not totally averse to the ICC, because the Bush administration did not stand in the way of the indictment of Bashir, and they could have. The Bush administration had, on the Security Council, had stopped any movement toward the indictment of Bashir. They could have moved to quash that indictment, and they didn't. They actually sat quietly by.
To exercise their veto.
They could have exercised their veto. They did not do so, and they allowed the indictment to go forward. The U.S. now has a number of considerations that it has to keep in mind on this case and on many other cases. The U.S. has a lot of political interests that need to be balanced against the judicial interests. Precisely in Sudan, you have the question that the U.S. was very much committed to the settlement between North and South, and moved in to bring that agreement to pass. And now the situation of the Bashir indictment may actually threaten that that settlement. So the question becomes not whether or not the U.S. will be legally willing to become a signatory. The question becomes, is it politically helpful for the U.S. to be a signatory in the context of the larger international relations objectives of the United States? I have a strong belief that, given the interests that this president has discussed, and given the people that are in place, Harold Koh among others, you will have advocates who will want to facilitate as much as possible, given the character of a certain set of U.S. senators, they will do the best they can to move the U.S. toward full participation in the International Criminal Court. I think there's no reason for the U.S. not to participate.